Okay, so we're running live. Today we're going to continue on with our discussion of Bramble's paper, The Case Against Meat. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Get the CC going here. Hopefully everybody's doing well. And happy Thursday to you. Here in rainy San Luis Obispo. Okay. So let's go maybe back up to the RKF argument. Get back here to slide 56 after we just recapped the argument briefly. Let's see. Oops, I think I went back way too far. Track it down here. Okay, good. I think we're right around here. Good. Okay, so here's the RKF argument that Bramble discusses. So he wants to challenge the practice of raising and killing animals for food. So that's what RKF stands for. Just to recap that point here. So premise one, RKF, raising and killing animals for food, is extremely bad for animals. But RKF, raising and killing animals for food, is only trivially good for human beings. So insignificantly good, the way of putting or way of defining trivially here. And then the conclusion, therefore, RKF should be stopped. Okay, so that's the argument. We talked last time about premise one and the potential objections to it, Bramble's replies to those objections. And this time we'll focus our attention on the second premise and then a couple of other objections that Bramble considers. I think we want to go back to 56. Yeah, right. So these were the objections that we talked about last time in order, and then we talked about Bramble's replies to them. So this is just a sketch of the discussion that we had last time, just to remind you. But here's premise two. Premise two, again, RKF is only trivially or insignificantly good for human beings. And this premise would contribute to the anti-RKF conclusion that Bramble is trying to argue for. So it's going to be a very similar strategy here. What Bramble is going to try to do is try to argue against the potential objections to the second premise. So we'll do what we did last time, is we'll retrace the arguments, the objections and the counter objections, the counter arguments. Okay. So in many cases, I'm providing the titles or the tags for the objections because Bramble himself doesn't do that. So we've got the health objection. That's our tag. So again, we're challenging this premise here that RKF is only trivially good for human beings. And one way of challenging that is to claim that meat is essential to human health. So RKF is not just trivially good for human beings. So that seems to be pretty straightforward objection to the second premise that Bramble considers. But Bramble is quick to note, there's a hot mic out there, so if it could be muted, that'd be great. Bramble's quick to note that the American Dietetic Association disagrees, so the ADA disagrees. Let's also have a look at the Bramble there. Look at the passage. Maybe I'll do it. Okay. So here we go. Many people believe that human beings need to eat meat in order to be healthy, but even the American Dietetic Association acknowledges that, quote, vegetarian diets, including total vegetarian or vegan diets, are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits in the prevention and treatment of certain diseases. So that's the passage from the ADA. So we don't then need meat to be healthy as human beings, if the ADA is right. But then Bramble says that there are many out there who just may disagree with the ADA. So they argue by maybe personal experience. So I call this a personal experience objection. And the claim basically, the upshot is basically that the ADA is wrong, at least with respect to some human beings. So sometimes I'll hear people say things like, even if something like the ADA is correct, for some human beings, given that human physiology admits of all kinds of diversity, it may not be true for all human beings. So Bramble, as you may know from reading the Bramble, doesn't sort of get into those sophistications. But the personal experience objection, as you can imagine, just runs like this. The ADA is wrong. It's wrong in terms of its generality, maybe be put that way. Personal experience confirms that meat is essential for many to retain healthy energy levels, to avoid lethargy, etc. So many people might make these kinds of claims. They might say, I tried to give up meat. I went vegetarian for a time, but I found myself low in energy, lethargic regularly, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, having healthy energy levels and not being lethargic contribute to being healthy generally. Okay, so this is now the second objection to premise 2. And Bramble offers several replies. So low energy levels, lethargy, etc. They're not independent sources of evidence that meat is essential for human health, even for those who are claiming otherwise. So what Bramble does is he appeals to things like food addictions, in particular meat addictions, claiming that people might feel low energy levels, they might feel lethargic because they're addicted to certain meat products. And of course, when we come off of addictions, or we're trying to break addictions more exactly, we'll experience withdrawals, and those withdrawals are often unpleasant. Oftentimes, the unpleasantness will include having low energy levels, feeling lethargic, perhaps feeling even pain, like headaches and pain in other parts of the body. So, of course, Bramble would need to cite some evidence that meat is something that people can be addicted to in the first place. There's some literature on that out there, as you can imagine, but these are just possibilities that he canvasses in order to try to respond to the objection here, to the objection from personal experience. And then more positively, Bramble, he claims that withdrawal symptoms will diminish or even disappear over time. They typically do. Anyway, so just think about the withdrawals that accompany quitting caffeine or coffee, teas, and the like. Those will diminish over time. They'll even disappear. And then likewise, the discomfort that can be associated with having cravings for meat, those can also diminish or even disappear over time. They may not completely disappear. Depends on how strong the cravings are, how significant the meat eating is for the individual in question. Some cravings don't go away. So I know some vegans who have cravings for animal products like cheese, though they're not considered, meat eaters, they're eating animal products. So think about like vegans who were once lacto-ovo vegetarians. So they enjoyed dairy products and eggs, for example. They'll claim that the craving for cheese never fully goes away, but it does diminish. Some they'll claim that it's disappeared completely. So just like the vegan will have cravings diminish or disappear over time, the meat eaters could have their cravings for meat diminish or even disappear over time. These are all possibilities. So the objection from personal experience in response to the second premise of the RKF argument that Bramble supports is responded to in this way. So there's a variety of responses, but kind of put them in a cluster together on this slide. Okay, so then we move on to a different kind of objection, the pleasure objection. So this is now the third objection to the second premise. So eating meat is very good for us in terms of our well-being because it provides us with significant pleasures. So without meat eating, according to a way of developing this objection, eating would become tiresome. Would become a tiresome exercise, resulting in life losing much of its appeal. So just think about how eating is such a significant part of our life. Life would lose quite a bit of appeal if we weren't enjoying the food that we were eating. Okay. So we see how the pleasure objection responds to the second premise, which just claims that RKF is only trivially good for us. Well, RKF is more than trivially good for us if it contributes significantly to the pleasure that we have in our lives. Okay, so that's a pleasure objection, pretty straightforward one that you could readily think of on your own, really, in response to the RKF argument. So the response by Bramble: vegetarian meals can be very pleasant and of a sufficient variety for meals and for life even to retain its appeal then, supposing that like mealtime contributes to life having appeal, which it does for many anyways. Though I do know some who claim that when they feel like they're eating the healthiest, they're really eating kind of bland, boring foods. And this is even by people who are meat eaters. But that's not something that Bramble even broaches. I just kind of noted anecdotally. It is true that for many of us, eating and enjoying meals is significant to our lives going well for us. So again, vegetarian meals can be a good substitute for meals that have that are based around or include meat products. And Bramble just sort of continues, and I just noted in this parenthetical that we shouldn't allow many of the bland vegetarian options at restaurants, mostly catering to meat eaters, taint our judgment of how pleasant and diverse vegetarian foods can be. So it is true that many of the restaurants out there that cater to meat eaters dominantly, so they have maybe just a few vegetarian options or maybe one vegetarian option on the menu. It's true that many of those meals can be quite bland just because they're not really the focus of the menu. But we shouldn't allow, according to Bramble, those bland vegetarian meals really fix and determine how good and diverse vegetarian meals can be. And many people who go vegetarian, one of the things that they'll often think is something like, well, their options have shrunk, so their meals will be less diverse than they were when they had the meat options available to them. Some reply to those claims by maintaining that, well, typically when people go vegetarian, then they're eating more plants and they're eating a more diverse array of plants. And so given that plants are very diverse and kinds of plants that are eminently edible for us, right, being diverse, right, that means that vegetarian consumption, vegetarian meals can be quite diverse as well. Okay, so so that's the reply to the pleasure objection here. And maybe one last point here is just that if people were just to generally go vegetarian and meat eating would fall by the wayside, then it's likely that like our taste buds would alter, would change, and we would really start enjoying collectively vegetarian dishes. So there is like research in this area about how taste buds can undergo changes to things that we find, the kinds of foods that we find pleasant, right, to our palate, right, those can change over time as well. Okay, Bramble doesn't get into that literature at all. at the best he alludes to it. But there is literature out there on it. So yeah, that's just sort of an anecdotal point, and just thinking about vegetarian responses to the second premise here. Vegetarian responses to objections to the second premise, more exactly. Okay, so the next objection, so now the fourth objection, as we're kind of moving swiftly here, is what I'll call the Lomaski objection, just because it's named after the person who presented it in the Bramble, so the Lomaski objection. And we'll call this the Lomaski objection 1. So surprise, surprise, there'll be a Lomaski objection 2. So a way of capturing this, just very, very roughly, is that meat is significantly good for us, is captured in, or that meat is significantly good for us, is captured in the widespread and powerful desire for meat, quote unquote. That quote comes from page 142 in the Bramble. So let's go down here. So after dealing with the pleasure objection, responding to it, top page 142, Bramble says, a more sophisticated argument has recently been offered by Lauren Lomaski. Lomaski claims that the pleasures of meat, quote, afford human beings goods comparable qualitatively and quantitatively to those held forth by the arts. Lives of many people would be significantly impaired were they to forego carnivorous consumption. So you might think that, you might think about here about how so much, about how meat eating and meal producing has an aesthetic connection, or has aesthetic features. We don't want our food just slopped down on a plate. We want our food to be presented beautifully, nicely. So I think that the aesthetic feature, the aesthetic properties of the meals that we consume is captured by the claim that Lomaski makes here at the very beginning of the passage. Comparing like our eating the pleasures of meat to enjoying the arts, perhaps the fine arts. And then Lomaski continues. Lomaski argues for this claim. Just say Bramble continues, and he's working on the Lomaski here. Lomaski argues for this claim by appeal to the widespread and powerful human desire for meat, or subjective importance to us. Okay. He observes that all across the globe, as incomes increase, so does the amount of meat in people's diets. When we look at the world's great cuisines, so this is Lomaski, we discover that almost without exception, they not only include meat, but also feature it as a focal point of fine meals in France, as in India, China, as in Italy. Meat is sovereign, so that many religions advance constraints on which animals are to be eaten and how the permissible ones are to be slaughtered and prepared, conveys a recognition of meat eating as being among the very important components of how human beings can live well. Okay. So I think we understand Lomaski's view, his objection here. So I just capture it in this bit here. Meat is significantly good for us, and not just trivially good for us, as the second premise claims. It's captured in the widespread and powerful desire for meat. Okay, and so there's a connection here between what we desire perhaps powerfully and in a widespread way, having some connection to what's intrinsically good for us. Or at least there's some tracking between these powerful, widespread desires and, what's intrinsically good for us. That seems to be in the background of the objection here. Twofold response by the Bramble, though. So the big picture, unifying counter objection by Bramble is that Lemassie's objection presupposes that desire satisfactionism or desire theory of well-being. So the twofold response begins with 1. So idealized versions of desire satisfactionism are preferable to the actual versions. We saw this in Tuesday's lecture, Tuesday's discussion of the Bramble. So remember, there are problems with the actual versions of desire satisfaction theory. Remember, we discussed the pointless desires problem and the bad desires problem, which could be actually had. So people can have pointless desires like counting the blades of grass in their backyard. According to an actual version of desire satisfactionism, that's intrinsically good once that desire is satisfied. That seems to be counterintuitive, argues Bramble and others, so we should go for a more idealized version of desire satisfactionism insofar as we're going to be a desire satisfaction theorist. If the pointless desires objection isn't good enough, well, there's the bad or murderous desires problem that it faces. So people actually have bad or murderous desires. And according to the actual versions of desire satisfaction theory, when a murderer, I don't know, Ted Bundy or some other example, has his actual murderous desires satisfied, intrinsic goodness, right, is instantiated in that person, instantiated in the world, right, by way of that person, and that seems to be the wrong result. So that's just to recap why the idealized version is deemed preferable to Bramble and to others in the literature. So then, continuing with the first of the twofold response, it may turn out that quote unquote widespread and powerful desires for meat are only actual desires. The significance of these being only actual desires is just that they may not be ones that contribute then to our well-being. Again, because these idealized versions of desire satisfactionism require that the relevant desires that contribute to our well-being are idealized desires, not the ones that we necessarily actually have. So it may be that more idealized desires, according to a desire satisfaction theory, would see our actual desires, our actual widespread and powerful desires for meat, to be non-ideal. So if I'm right here with Bramble on page 142 again, after citing this passage by David Sobel, who's a professor at Syracuse University, he writes, David Sobel, Bramble writes of David Sobel that idealized desires are more fully for their object as it is really rather than for the as it really is rather than for the object as it is falsely believed to be. So the idea is that our more idealized desires are going to be like more truth conducive. They're going to capture reality as they're going to capture the nature of the object as it is better than our actual desires often do. This is a problem because while it may be true that most people have a very strong desire to eat or enjoy meat, it is not clear that they would continue to have this desire if they were suitably idealized, so if they were their more mature selves with the ideal desires. In fact, it seems likely that apprised in a vivid way of all the gory details of the manner in which most animals who end up on our plates are raised and killed, most of us would not want to eat meat, let alone enjoy it ever again. Of course, there can be some debate here about whether or not Bramble's right about this, but there's sort of maybe some there's some common credence to some common claims out there that lend credence to this claim that's being captured by the Bramble here. Passages by philosophers which in the past who have claimed that if if people saw where their meat came from, they wouldn't eat it, or if slaughterhouses were hid from us, but were such that they had walls that were see-through, so that we could see how animals are treated in the slaughterhouses and then killed in the slaughterhouses, we would struggle remaining meat eaters. So there's some, like, maybe some anecdotal wisdom there, but some debate could be had here, of course, in response. So the debate might get cut short, though, if Bramble is right about the second part of his twofold response, that just desire satisfaction theory itself is implausible. So we saw last time that Bramble thinks that some version of hedonism is true, desire satisfactionism is false. And so, the move to idealize desires in a satisfaction theory, even if that's preferable, even if it turns out that there's counters to the way Bramble responds to Lomaski's objection by appealing to the idealized versions of desire satisfactionism, there's still in Bramble's back pocket this challenge to desire satisfaction theory. So here, Bramble, that is, brings back the Gertie example. So remember, Gertie is the dog who gets to enjoy these diverse pleasures. So top of page 143, Bramble notes, second, as I also suggest that above desire-based theories of well-being are implausible. There's not space here to fully make the case against such theories, but recall my claim above that such theories cannot explain the value for us of future pleasures. So there was an implicit argument above using the Gertie example that I didn't initially see, but that's made more evident now in this passage from the Bramble. So it seems good for Gertie, Bramble continues, that seems for Gertie the dog, that she lived on until today to experience an array of qualitatively new doggy pleasures. Remember, going to the park and sniffing new areas and all the rest. Even if this involved no desire of hers being satisfied. Okay. So, this seems to challenge the desire, or to challenge desire satisfaction theories of well-being, just because it seems like it's going to be good for Gertie to go and experience these pleasures in the new park, etc., even if they involve no desires being satisfied by Gertie. Right? She didn't have maybe the time to form the desires, but yet enjoys the pleasant experiences nonetheless. So they're sort of like an argument, at least an initial argument, against desire theories of well-being, desire satisfaction theories of well-being, just based on an intuitive case. Okay. So if desire-based theories are false, then even if our desires to eat or enjoy meat were to survive idealization, so even if eating meat, or the desire to eat meat, were among our idealized desires, more exactly, this would not show our eating or enjoying it to be significantly good for us. Why? Because what's significantly good for us involves pleasant experiences, not having our even idealized desire satisfied. So again, even though I recognize that there can be some debate about what's going to end up included in our set of idealized desires, whether our desires for eating meat will end up doing so, Bramble can offer the Gertie example again to show that what contributes significantly to our lives going well for us, what's good for us as human beings, right, in a non-trivial way, it's going to be having pleasant experiences, not having our desire satisfied. In the first place, whether they're actual or idealized desires. So the Gertie example is doing quite a bit of work for the Bramble, and it'll do further work later, so hang tight on that. Okay, so that's Lomaski objection 1, a twofold reply. But no worries, perhaps we can run the Lomaski objection in a better way, in a way that's more in line with a hedonistic view, a view according to which pleasant experiences determine fundamentally what's good for us in a significant way. So again, our tag, the Lomaski objection 2, is going to run accordingly. So the pleasures of meat are good for us because of the, quote, particular phenomenology, end quote, of the pleasures themselves, which no current vegetarian technology can replace. And then relatedly, the practice of eating meat is a significant cultural good. This is something that is commonly noted in debates in the literature, providing us with distinct pleasures, which no current vegetarian technology can replace. So you might think there's just two different kinds of pleasure that are worth identifying. And so we're not committed in this version of the Lomaski objection to a desire-based theory of well-being. In fact, we run the objection by couching it as couching it in terms that's consistent with the hedonistic theory of well-being, one that Bramble can be amenable to. So it might be helpful to say a couple words about this particular phenomenology phrase that's used in the Bramble. And so Bramble, he tries to define it. I think he does a real nice job of it here in the second full paragraph on page 143. He says, there's, however, a different and better way to argue for Lomaski's claim. So that's why I see this as just a different way of running the Lomaski objection. That this is to say that the pleasures of meat are extremely good for us, not because we want or would want them, right? And really want them in a widespread kind of way, as we talked about in the earlier objection, but just because of the particular phenomenology of these pleasures themselves. And the phenomenology, the term phenomenology is in part defined in this parenthetical. That is what it's like to experience them. So when we talk about the phenomenology of pleasures, we're talking about what it's like to experience them. Okay. So the phenomenology is often understood as the what it's likeness, if I could put it that way. So it's like to experience something, and then again, no vegetarian diet, at least given present technology, is able to provide a particular pleasurable phenomenology, to provide this particular pleasurable phenomenology. But even the petri dish meat that's out there likely struggles to capture all the phenomenological features of meat, of genuine non-petri dish animal meat that's out there. Okay. And then just to capture the second point here, moreover may be added, if we all stop eating meat, then our cultures would be greatly diminished. And along with these, the richness of our social and cultural encounters. One way we stay connected to our ancestors is through the meals they passed down onto us, or they passed down to us. If we all stopped eating meat, then this important link with the past would be severed. And I do think that based on the way that Bramble continues his discussion here, he does mean to include that there is something pleasant about these cultural experiences that we have. Okay. So hopefully this idea of particular phenomenology makes sense here. The way it feels from the inside, as it were, when we experience these pleasures is another way of understanding the particular phenomenology of the pleasures, in the case of pleasures of consuming meat. Okay, so this is likely a stronger objection, Lomaski objection 2, than Lomaski objection 1, because it doesn't presuppose desire satisfaction theory, which in both its actual and idealized forms seem to be implausible. Again, if Bramble is right, there are desire satisfaction theorists out there who think that Bramble is wrong, and we didn't get into those debates this time. But if you are interested, Chris Heathwood, he's a prominent contemporary desire satisfaction theorist, and so he would disagree with Bramble on that. He actually stays actual with respect to desire satisfaction theory, if that interests some of you. So he doesn't go idealized. He thinks it violates the subjectivist spirit of a desire satisfaction theory. Okay, but that's an anecdote. That's a little sidebar, just in case you're interested in knowing who a contemporary desire satisfaction theorist is who disagree with Bramble. So Bramble, his response to Lemaski objection 2 is captured here. We must accept that meat eating provides significant phenomenological pleasures and important cultural goods. And he understands these goods as pleasures ultimately. I think I'm missing an us here. Provides us significant phenomenological pleasures. I think us with was missing to make that grammatical. Yeah, there we go. So the cultural goods, for Bramble, they're going to have to end up bottoming out at pleasures, right? Because what's good, for us is going to be determined foundationally by pleasant experiences. So that's just his hedonism coming out again. So nevertheless, we must ask, according to Bramble, this is his counter to the Lemaski objection 2, we must ask whether the latter goods are a net good. So there's a concessive point initially, and then there's the point that has teeth in response to the objection, the counter objection. We must ask whether the latter goods are a net good, and you can guess how Bramble answers the question. He's going to say, no, it's not a net good. So then it's going to turn out, if Bramble's right, that that RKF, raising and killing animals for food, really is only trivially good for us, insignificantly good for us. So when we weigh the goods that we must accept according to Bramble, we weigh them against the bads, it ends up being the case that at best we're left with the good being merely trivial for us, the good of raising and killing animals for food, or the good that comes from consuming meat. Okay. So Bramble, he's going to offer a threefold response. So the basic, line of reply after the concessive point is going to be this. We must ask whether the latter goods are net good. The answer is going to be no. So then why not? We get the threefold reply. But really 3 lines of reasoning. We're thinking that the net's going to not be non-trivially good for us. And I try to capture these 1 through 3 here, but 3 is going to take a little bit of work. So 1 and 2, pretty straightforward. So 1, cultural goods and pleasures can change over time. So it could turn out that, yeah, there's going to be an initial cost when we give up meat eating because we shouldn't raise and kill animals for food. If the RKF argument goes through, but we can transition to vegetarian lifestyles, and then those will then be the lifestyles that we pass on generationally. Those will be the lifestyles that we enjoy with one another, vegetarian lifestyles. So we shouldn't think that just because the cultural goods are such at a time that they have to remain fixed at that time, right, forevermore. Indeed, we know that cultural goods they actually have changed over time in some cases for the better. 2, one significant cost that counts against the overall goodness of consuming meat and the practices that are associated with raising and killing animals for food and enjoying meat. The fact that meat is costly to produce. Goods can be increased in other areas if we were to stop producing meat, if we were to stop raising and killing animals for food. So we can redirect money to other things like health, education, and infrastructure. These goods, they're really just listed by Bramble, but these are things that are supposed to contribute positively to pleasant experiences, being healthful or being healthy, living a healthy life, eating healthfully. Education tends to be associated with experience diverse pleasures related to, enjoying things intellectually, etc. And then infrastructure changes, changing the ways in which our world is designed in terms of infrastructure, perhaps making things more environmentally sound, perhaps designing infrastructure that doesn't contribute to global warming or even more positively counteracts global warming, these kinds of things. So he doesn't discuss these in any detail. I'm just throwing out some ideas anecdotally as possibilities that emerge when we think about these three options that Bramble provides us. Okay, and then the third point, again, is going to be a bit more complex. I think 1 and 2 are pretty straightforward, but 3, meat eating may well have significant psychological costs, even if those costs are unconsciously incurred. Okay. And these psychological costs would foundationally for Bramble involve, sufferings or pains, just because he's a hedonist in his thinking. So at bottom, when we flesh out number 3, the psychological costs are going to be related to pains, sufferings, psychological pains, suffering. Okay. So before we move on to the next objection, let's look at the Bramble, so we can just get a sense of what's going on. So top of page 144, proof that that Bramble just lists those redirections that could lead to goods, right? You see here, health, education, infrastructure, and so on. He doesn't go in any detail in discussing them. He moves then on to the third of his threefold reply to Lomaski objection 2. So third, there are reasons to believe that there could be some heavy psychological costs associated with meat consumption. Consider first that most of us grow up as children who love animals. When we first discover that the meat on our plate is the body of an animal who has been killed for our consumption, that distresses us greatly. When we learn further of what goes on in farms and slaughterhouses, even free-range ones, many of us are truly horrified. We are, however, very good at putting these thoughts out of our heads and carrying on with our meat eating, especially given the often considerable social and economic pressure to do so. So it could be that some of the psychological costs are ones that we're consciously aware of, but then they could become subconscious or unconscious even. Okay. And the social economic pressure to continue eating meat, partially is going to involve the fact that oftentimes it's easier to eat meat products socially. The meat products are more readily available. And then economic pressure, oftentimes meat products are going to end up being less expensive when we consider the number of calories we're getting from an animal product compared to the cost that would be associated with getting a similar number of calories from plant products. Just to provide some content there in the Bramble. There's a growing body of evidence, he continues, that most of us experience many kinds of significant pleasurable and unpleasurable feelings without being aware of them. So that's where the unconscious psychological costs kick in. That is in the background of our consciousness. An especially vivid example on the pleasure side is provided by a patient of Oliver Sacks, who writes, Quote, sense of smell, I never gave the thought. I never gave it a thought. You don't normally give it a thought, but when I lost it, it was like being struck blind, life lost, a good deal of its savor. One doesn't realize how much savor is smell. You smell people, you smell books, you smell the city, excuse me. You smell the spring, maybe not consciously, but as a rich unconscious background to everything else. My whole world was suddenly radically poorer, end quote. I think about those who, lost their sense of smell from, COVID-19, sense of taste and smell from COVID-19. Some for very short periods, but some it's lasted and continues to last for them. Perhaps they would empathize with Oliver Sacks here in this passage. So that's on the side of pleasure, but now on the side of unpleasurable experiences. Daniel Habron, he writes, quote, some affective states are more elusive than the paradigmatic ones, particularly moods and mood-like states such as anxiety, tension, ennui, malaise. So ennui is a kind of boredom. Malaise is a kind of just feeling not at ease, at least in part. They may exceed our powers of discernment even while they are occurring. A vague sense of malaise might easily go unnoticed, yet it can sour one's experience far more than the sharper and more pronounced ache that persists after having stubbed one's toe. Likewise for depression, anxiety, and related mood states, at least in their milder forms. Consider how a tense person will often learn of it only when receiving a massage, whereas stressed or anxious individuals, top of page 145, continue, may discover their emotional state only by attending to the physical symptoms of their distress. Presumably being tense, anxious, or stressed detracts substantially from the quality of one's experience, even when one is unaware of these states. Maybe some like anecdotal support for what Daniel Habron is claiming here is that sometimes we'll find ourselves saying things like, oh, I didn't know I was under that much stress. I didn't know that I was so pent up with anxiety. I didn't know I was that anxious and all the rest. And sometimes that occurs after maybe we've had a fallout with a friend. We got into an argument with someone or a family member who knows us well, just recognizes something in us that just is off, but we didn't notice it ourselves. I think Habron's capturing, ideas like those in his passage. And the question, how can this happen? So Habron tries to offer an explanation for this. So everyone knows that we often adapt to things over time. What was once pleasing now leaves no impression or seems tiresome. And what used to be highly irritating is now just another feature of the landscape. Could it also be that some things are lastingly pleasant or unpleasant while our awareness of them fades? I would suggest that it can. Perhaps you have lived with a refrigerator that often whined due to a bad bearing. If so, you might have found that with time you entirely ceased to notice the racket, but occasionally when the compressor stopped, you did notice a sudden glorious silence. You might also have noted first a painful headache, and second that you'd had no idea how obnoxious the noise was, or that it was occurring at all until it ceased. But obnoxious it was, and all the while it had been, unbeknownst to you, fouling your experience as you went about your business. In short, you've been having an unpleasant experience without knowing it. Moreover, you might well have remained unaware of the noise even when reflecting on whether you were enjoying yourself. The problem here is ignorance. Call it reflective blindness, and not, as some have suggested, the familiar sort of inattentiveness we find when only peripherally aware of something. In such cases, we can bring our attention to the experience easily and at will. Here, the failure of attention is much deeper. We are so lacking in awareness that we can't attend to the experience, at least not without prompting, as occurs when the noise suddenly changes. Okay, or as occurs when the noise suddenly changes. So this is all kind of set up, right? Because there's been no discussion of the psychological costs associated with RKF, or raising and killing animals for food, and enjoying meat. Similarly, Bramble now continues, and quote with the Hebron just a moment ago. Similarly, I want to suggest it may be the case that knowing what meat is, and in particular, what we do to animals in farming and slaughtering them for food, sours or pollutes our experiences of eating meat, and perhaps our experiences of living in this world more generally, in ways that are very hard or even impossible to attend to while we are still meat eaters. Certainly, many people claim to find the experience of giving up meat similar in various respects to the experience of Hebron, describes of being at home in one's kitchen when the compressor of the wine refrigerator switches off. Many report they have experienced a tremendous sense of relief or freedom or a lightness of being after giving up meat, feelings they had not anticipated, and that they suggest were experiencing unconscious, and that they were experiencing, and that suggests they were experiencing unconscious pain beforehand. And then Bramble continues. So I'm reading the Bramble in part just because he puts it better than I could have on my slides. The passages from the Sachs and the Hebron are just better than I could have put them. And then Bramble's own writing here is, as he's unpacking the ideas and relating them to responding to the second objection, the second objection that we're considering to Lomaski, right? That we discussed above, right? Just put better, put more clearly than I could have put it on a few slides. So again, continuing, part of the unconscious pain I felt, or felt by meat eaters, I suspect, has to do with their having deliberately turned away when they were children from something that they sensed at the time was an important moral issue. This turning away seems likely to leave one with a burden comparable to that carried by a person who has reason to suspect a friend of theirs having committed some heinous crime, but who refuses to investigate further or turn their friend in for some relatively trivial reason, say fear of upsetting the balance of her social life. People who ignore qualms they have or silence parts of themselves cannot be entirely happy individuals. Moreover, their being like this may prevent them from being the sort of open people who are able to take joy in many other aspects of life. So ignoring this issue of meat, refusing to investigate, may close one off to various other possible pleasures. So that's the long discussion, right? Bramble's third of our discussion of Bramble's third of his threefold response here. Meat eating may well have significant psychological costs, even if those costs are unconsciously incurred. So note here, I put even if those costs are unconsciously incurred, they could be consciously incurred as well. It's just even if it's just saying that they could be unconsciously incurred in the ways described by Hayden and Ford and Sachs. So the way of thinking about what's going on here is Bramble's taking like that literature and is applying it to the costs associated with being complicit in consuming meat, the animal products that come from RKF, the raising and killing animals for food. Okay. Another objection is the free range replacement objection. So we're moving on from the Lomaski objections and now dealing with this new one. What about an RKF system, a system of raising and killing animals for food that uses only free range animals that have lived long natural lives? So this is why we call it the free range replacement objection. This isn't bad for the animals, and it's good for us in the ways discussed above, right? The ways that contribute, positively to our pleasant experiences. So, so in a way, the free range replacement objection is to continue on in a way with the Lomaski objection too. Wherein we're only focused on a certain small subset, right, of the animals, and we raise them in a way that Bramble's already claimed, right, isn't bad for the animals. So we can get the pleasant experiences, the pleasant experience that involve, enjoying what it's likeness of enjoying and consuming animal products, consuming meat, and the other cultural pleasures that come. Right, so those are the goods, the relevant goods that were discussed above that are just mentioned on this slide. This is captured by going back to the Bramble when he right after dealing with the Lomaski objection 2, as we're calling it, he says it may be objected. What about free range farming? And then he goes on to describe the free range, the relevant free range animals that would be part of an RKF program or system. Those that are given long lives, right? Live long natural lives, and then are killed and consumed thereafter. Remember an earlier reply to using such animals in an RKF system was that there's not much of a market for them, because if the older the animal gets, the tougher the meat gets, the more tasteless the meat gets, etc. But Bramble's response, he concedes that an RKF system, such an RKF system, free range RKF system, would not be bad for the animals. In this way, we should not be disturbed by raising and killing animals for food. And then he concludes, so after the concession, he concludes by saying that it would still cause psychological suffering, the suffering that accompanies our thoughts of what happens in slaughterhouses. Okay, so he goes back to this idea of psychological suffering. So if we go to page 147, he says, first full paragraph on page 147, I suspect that for many of us, there's a similar pain, albeit often an unconscious one, that accompanies our thoughts of what takes place in slaughterhouses, even slaughterhouses where the animals in question have been killed painlessly without their anticipation. These practices are unavoidably grisly. The thought of the bodies of these animals being taken apart, ending up on our plates, and being devoured by us is a painful reminder of what we all are, embodied beings prone to disease, suffering, and death. So before he arrives at that conclusion, at the bottom page 146 claims that for most of us, the thought of dead bodies of our friends and loved ones, or even of those of complete strangers being cut up or torn to pieces, is deeply distressing. And something similar can hold for us when we think about the dead bodies of animals and how those dead bodies end up getting treated. They end up being produced in various ways and ending up on our plates, and that can produce in us a psychological distress, which is a cost. Even when we're talking about free range animals that have been given long lives and then are run through an RKF system. Okay. So premise 2, recap just to have all the objections before us. So remember, premise 2 is RKF is only trivially good for human beings. Remember, premise 1 is that RKF is extremely bad for the animals. And then we ran through 6 objections and Bramble's replies to them. So the health objection, the personal experience objection, the pleasure objection, and then the Lomaski objection 1 and 2, and then the free range replacement objection. I thought that 1, 2, 3, and 6 were pretty straightforward in terms of presentation and responses. It's really Lomaski objections 1 and 2 that were a bit more involved. Okay, a bit less straightforward. Okay, so it looks like things are looking good for the RKF argument and Bramble's argument for the wrongness of the RKF programs, the raising and killing animals, and thus for the wrongness of eating meat generally. But then there's the 2 final objections to consider. The first is the triviality of animal well-being. So a new objection here emerges in response to the raising and killing animals for food argument. Animal well-being is insignificant, and so we'll call this the animal well-being is insignificant objection. And the way we can think about this objection is in the following way. Even though premises 1 and 2 are true, it could be granted. Since animal well-being is comparatively insignificant, we cannot conclude from 1 and 2 that RKF should be adopted. So in this way, then, the nature of this objection is that the argument is invalid, logically invalid. So sometimes we use the term invalid in our ordinary speaking to mean something like untrue. But here we don't mean that. We mean invalid to mean something more technical. We mean that even if the premises are true in the argument, the conclusion could very well still be false. So that's why we say we cannot conclude from 1 and 2 that RKF should be stopped. And of course, the conclusion of the RKF argument is that RKF should be stopped. So keep in mind, we're thinking about this notion of invalidity in a logical, technical sense, not in the colloquial sense. So, so it could be true that RKF is extremely bad for animals. It could also be true that RKF is only trivially good for human beings. It still might be the case that RKF should not be stopped. That's what you're thinking about the relevant sense of invalidity as we provide it with content. So, quote, this is a quote from page 147, quote, great harm to animals, this is Bramble, great harm to animals is less bad than the relatively small sacrifice involved for us in giving up meat. So even if it is extremely bad for animals, bad for the animals, right, that they're raised and killed for food, right, that is bad for them, their welfare, or their things going poorly for them, just so insignificant, right, that it doesn't matter enough. So again, great harm to animals, extreme harm to animals is less bad than the relatively small sacrifice involved for us in giving up meat. Right. So this bit about it about the sacrifice being relatively small, right, giving up meat, yeah, is supposed to be consistent with the second premise being true. Okay, and then the great harm to animals is that bit is obviously consistent with the first premise. So you get this claim here being consistent with both the first and second premises of the RKF argument. Excuse me. Response. Again, Bramble response is plausible that the well-being of some being. It's implausible, excuse me, that the well-being of some being is worth more than the well-being of another being. So according to Bramble, the only difference in well-being is quantitative. So you've got, the foundation of well-being, you have intrinsic goodness had, right, for the relevant being in question, whether it be Gertie the dog or it be, Joe Biden, the human being. The only difference, right, between the well-being is going to be when we compare the well-being of Gertie with the well-being of Joe Biden, is going to be understood in quantitative terms, like amounts, quantitative amounts. And here's a quote from page 147 from the Bramble that captures this positive claim here. It seems far more plausible to think that the intrinsic value of some increase in a being's lifetime well-being, whether again it's Gertie the dog or Joseph Biden, is proportional just to the amount of the increase. Okay, not that Joseph Biden's or Joe Biden's, I don't know why I just called him Joseph, but that is his name, but Joe Biden's well-being levels are just worth more than Gertie's well-being levels. Okay, worth more in some like qualitative sense, I'm assuming Bramble has in mind here. So then why do some think that, Joe Biden's well-being is worth more than Gertie the dog's well-being? And Bramble claims that because some confuse the claim that we have greater capacity to enjoy more diverse goods with the claim that our well-being has more significance. So it's true, according to Bramble, that Joe Biden has a greater capacity to enjoy a more diverse array of good things than does Gertie the dog. That doesn't mean that Joe Biden's well-being is worth more qualitatively than Gertie the dog's well-being. All right. And so let's go to the Gertie the dog example again, page 148. So Gertie the dog, where does he come in? He comes in, here in the third full paragraph, page 148. The reason human beings are capable of much higher levels of lifetime well-being, I believe, has to do with the point I made in the first section, namely that purely repeated pleasures add nothing to a being's level of lifetime well-being. Human beings have available to them much greater diversity and pleasurable experiences than other animals do. While I claimed above that Gertie the family dog may experience many qualitatively new pleasures on a given day in exploring the park, meeting other new dogs, smelling new smells, and so on, I think these pleasures are quite limited when compared with the pleasures we humans are able to obtain from our much deeper relationships with each other, much greater capacity to understand ourselves and learn about the world, more sophisticated experience of art and beauty, ability to appreciate the importance of things, set goals, and work toward their completion, and the capacity for selfless and virtuous behavior. Right, but he continues, it's an easy mistake to confuse this greater capacity for well-being with our well-beings having greater value, but it is a mistake. The death of a normal cow in a paddock is less bad than the premature death of a normal human being, but it is not because human well-being matters more than animal well-being. It is because there's much more that a continued life can add to the lifetime well-being of a normal human being than to the life of a cow. When we do genuinely harm animals a lot, as RKF does, this is extremely bad. Right. So keep in mind that Bramble, he's a hedonist. That's been documented sufficiently, I think. But remember, in our discussion of hedonism earlier in the term, we talked about how there was an effort by the philosopher John Stuart Mill to preserve a kind of hedonism that claimed that human beings could experience qualitatively superior pleasures compared to the pleasures that animals can experience. They can only experience the lower ones on his view. And so one way of understanding that is Mill, he believed that human well-being was worth more than animal well-being in virtue of the fact that human beings can experience these higher pleasures, these qualitatively superior pleasures. We saw that there was a problem with that view because it ended up refuting hedonism itself, because we would then need something besides pleasure to account for the qualitative superiority, right, of the higher pleasures compared to the lower ones. Bramble, he's aware of this. He's aware of the fact that once one claims that there are these qualitatively superior pleasures that allow one to say that one being's well-being is worth more than another being's well-being, that hedonism is going to struggle surviving. And so what Bramble does is he avoids going that route and says that the only difference is really, right, when we think about well-being levels of a Biden versus the well-being level of Gertie the dog, right, is purely quantitative as opposed to going the qualitative route. They recognize that if he does go the qualitative route, then he may end up refuting the very hedonism he's attempting to defend. He's not going to fall into the problem that Mill fell into when trying to develop his version of hedonism. His version of hedonism was trying to account for why it is that we think that the well-being of a human being is more significant, worth more ultimately than the well-being of, say, a Gertie the dog, in Mill's example of, Porky the pig or something like that, to give the pig a name. So anyways, that's just to connect up some of this Bramble with some historical precedents that we've discussed earlier in the class. Okay, a final objection arises. Yet a final objection arises, we'll call this a causal impotence objection. So even if the RKF argument is sound, that is, it has true premises and it's logically valid in the ways that we've talked about. So even if we should stop RKF, which is what the conclusion has it, right, which is what the conclusion is of the RKF argument, and that conclusion is properly supported, right, by the premises 1 and 2. We have no reason to stop eating meat because we can't make a causal difference in the production of meat. So that's why we call this the causal impotence objection, the causal powerlessness objection, if you want to call it that. Okay. So RKF should be stopped, but individuals should continue, or individuals have no reason to stop consuming meat, would be a way of thinking about this objection based on causal impotence. Response is twofold response. Suppose we can't make a causal difference. And the reason why we can't make a causal difference may be just because the RKF programs, systems more exactly, would be big agribusiness. So individual consumers are just unlikely, or we can even assume impossibly, they're impossibly able to make a difference with respect to the production levels of the farm animals, assuming that we're talking about even the free range animals under discussion, that have been under discussion. So suppose we can't make a causal difference, we can be free, though, of the psychological costs associated with being complicit in RKF. So here there's an appeal to RKF, or an appeal to psychological costs again, the psychological costs associated with being complicit in eating animal products that come from, right, an RKF program, which we believe we should stop, should be stopped on the basis of an RKF argument. And then we can help our friends, we can help free our friends with these psychological costs as well. So we can try to talk sense into our friends who can't make a causal difference with respect to the production of farm animals in RKF systems. So this is a self-interested reason, number one, a self-interested response, and then this is an altruistic response because we're interested in helping our friends. So the first response here, again, supposing we can't make a causal difference, is, you could say, a reason, a counter objection that involves thinking about just taking one's own self-interest seriously. It's not our own self-interest not to be complicit in RKF. And then two, as I say, is an altruistic consideration because it involves concern with someone other than ourselves, in this case, our friends, perhaps others. Okay. So then we have the conclusion, which really just basically summarizes what Bramble does. So he tries to shore up the case against meat eating, by offering new responses to the four main objections to this argument. In the first section, argued that RKF is bad for animals, not by bringing them into existence, but by giving worse lives to the animals that it has brought into existence than these same animals might have had. I argued that even free-range farming is bad for animals by giving them shorter lives than they would have if they had lived on until old age. Okay. In the second section, one that we just concluded, basically, argue that while the absence of the pleasures of meat in a person's life represents a significant loss for that person, it is not a significant net loss. It may not even be a net loss at all in light of the opportunity costs of meat eating and the possibly heavy psychological costs associated with meat eating. And in the third section, I try to explain why human beings are capable of higher levels of lifetime well-being than other animals on this planet, And so why some people are might mistakenly believe that human well-being is more valuable than animal well-being. And then finally, in the last section, I pointed out that it is no objection to the case against meat if, as individuals, we cannot save or improve any animal's life by becoming vegetarian. I then suggested that even if we cannot save or improve any animal's life by becoming vegetarian, we have sufficient self-interested reason to stop eating meat due to psychological costs of meat eating. I described in the second section, but we also have, as I've noted, um, altruistic reasons related to our friends and trying to alleviate their psychological costs. Our friends, or even others, I think I noted. We should stop raising and killing animals for food. Our practice of doing so is very harmful for these animals, and it's not very good, and perhaps can even on balance be bad for us. So note there, our practice of doing so is very harmful for these animals, and it's not very good, and perhaps even on balance. So he ends up kind of concluding with the claim that it's perhaps on balance bad for us. So you're right. It's one thing to say, according to the second premise, right, that that RKF is trivially good for us. It's another thing to claim that it's bad for us. And so it could turn out that, according to Bramble here, that it just may be bad for us. All he needs, though, is to claim that RKF, right, is, for the second premise, all he needs is that RKF is trivially good for us. But of course, you can imagine a strengthened RKF, which established RKF argument, which has a second premise according to which RKF is bad for human beings as well. So it's not just extremely bad for the animals; it's on balance bad for us as human beings. And then you get the same conclusion. So RKF should be stopped. Okay, so that concludes the Bramble. That concludes our PowerPoint here. One thing I'll just say in conclusion, something administrative. So let's go here. I think I can just click here. Good. So here we are. We are concluding week 4. This term is flying by for me. I don't know if it is for you, but it is for me. So we just concluded week 4. So we are on pace to have a second writing assignment posted. I'll have it posted on Saturday, 5 p.m.-ish. I'm doing nonprofit work all weekend. I start on Friday and I'll be working through the weekend, but I still will be able to get that assignment posted by 5 p.m. on Saturday for sure. It'll be due the following Saturday. And despite my busyness with this nonprofit work that I've mentioned, I will be grading the first writing assignments too. So by the end of the weekend, at the latest, by Monday-ish, I will have the first writing assignment graded. There's some reasons why I'm taking some extra time to grade the first writing assignment. It has to do with posting a very similar assignment for another class. I just want to make sure that everything's above board with that. So second writing assignment will be posted, and by the end of the weekend, at the very latest, middle of Monday-ish, I'll be done grading the first writing assignment. So that's where we're at with respect to those administrative matters, in case you were curious. Are there any questions, comments, concerns, anything I could clarify in the last minute we have before today's discussion ends?
I have a question. Okay. So this is specifically for farming animals, because we're talking about
RKF.
Yeah, we're talking about RKF and then free range animals, but what about hunting or fishing? Like, is it only unethical because of the practice of farming, or because an animal dies and we're using their body?
Yeah. A way of thinking about the Bramble here is his argument is focused on the raising and killing animals for food, that practice. He may have to develop other arguments if you wanted to, challenge our hunting practices and our consumption of even roadkill and the like, right? So
right. So then would he also, so when he's talking about a vegetarian diet, does he mean vegan diet? Because would he be against raising cows for their milk?
I don't think so. He might be personally, but in his paper, it's really designed to go after meat.
Yeah, like,
He's-
okay.
The taking him at what he says at face value. I just think that even Bramble would recognize that he would need to write another paper if he's going to endorse a vegan diet, and he'd need to write perhaps even further papers to argue against consuming animals that we've hunted, and or consuming animals that are roadkill.
Yeah.
If you wanted to run those arguments in the first place. So um,
I visited a dairy in California. It's supposed to be like the number one, I forget what they called it. Like it was like supposed to be like an ethical dairy or something, and it was
Mhm.
pretty heartbreaking to be there. I mean, I use dairy, but it was definitely like this is supposed to be the best possible conditions for a dairy animal. And
very depressing. You're right. Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
so I mean, I just like understand the argument for like the way that meat is raised, but I think that he could also apply it to dairy.
Oh yeah, I think so as well. I think that he'd probably be in agreement with you on that. It's just, yeah, again, just taking him at face value. You know, his papers against meat, and then um, he just begins straight away with the RKF argument, and then takes off from there. So I think that a way of thinking about that is his paper is titled against meat, but he wants to let you know just straight away, immediately, the focus is on the practice of raising and killing animals for food, right? So his
Right.
project is circumscribed in that way. But you're absolutely right that further argumentation would be needed to arrive at more specific claims.
Yeah, I'm just curious, like if he would say, oh, you know, dairy is unethical, but it's ethical to hunt meat or something like that. So,
Yeah, I mean, it might not be on his view intrinsically unethical, because it could be that, on traditional farms, thinking about traditional farms, not the industry farms that we have nowadays, that we give animals, we give the cows relatively good lives, really good lives, and then don't kill them, right? They just die of natural causes. But while they were alive and for a significant segment of their lives, we use them here and there for our dairy products.
yeah.
And
Okay.
so you're right. But yeah, that's the great point. So thanks for sharing about the dairy farm that you went to here in California. That's supposed to be really, really good there.
Yeah, it was a trip. It was very strange.
Yeah, there are these animal welfare and rights groups out there that do reports on dairy products. So you can do some research to see if some of those reports are favorable, and then perhaps find those dairy products in the market, like maybe Whole Foods or some such. Maybe you'd have to go to like a co-op to get those, but
Yeah, I think that my sister, she like I don't know, she cares a lot about this and she was getting it through like some specific farm and it like comes in glass bottles or whatever it was, and I think it's local. It's like available at specific locations around SLO County. So
great. All right,
okay,
well,
thank
that.
you.
Yep, have a great one. Take care. And take care, everybody else. I'm going to stop sharing, stop recording. Have a great weekend, and I'll be in touch very soon. Bye bye.